Welcome to the Fire These Times. I'm your host Joey Ayoub. If you'd like to support this podcast as well as other projects, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check out the support page for other methods. If you cannot donate, you can still support this podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening and stay safe out there. So this is a conversation with Francesco Saverio Leopardi about his recently released book, The Palestinian Left and Its Decline, Loyal Opposition. It's a conversation that is obviously rather academic, but we tried our best to make sure that we keep a broader audience in mind. You don't have to know much about the Palestinian left or the Arab left for that matter to find this episode interesting, I hope. As with all of these episodes, my intention is not just to do a deep exploration into a particular topic, although that is partly what we've done here. I'm fairly convinced that regardless of where you come from or what your background is, you'll find something in this conversation that might apply to your own context. If that is the case, I would genuinely be very interested to hear about it. You can get in touch via Patreon or just by email. My email is available on the website. Okay, that's enough from me. Enjoy this episode and thank you for listening.
My name is Saverio Leopardi. I am a research fellow at the Ca' Foscari University of Venice, where I work on contemporary history of the Middle East and North Africa with a special focus on Palestine and Algeria. So the topic of our conversation will largely be on Palestine, and it's on your latest book, which is called The Palestinian Left and Its Decline, Loyal Opposition. So let's start with general background, if that's okay. Like, how did you come to do this research? What is the book about? Of course, like, try and pitch it in a sense to listeners. But yeah, so that, of course, our conversation is going to be on this. Let's start with that. So my book is on the history of the marginalization process that the main Palestinian leftist faction, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, lived between 1982 and 2007. And it is really the result of a research process that started almost a decade ago. I was working on my master dissertation and I wanted to do something on the Palestinian national movement. And while doing my readings, I actually noticed two interesting aspects. One is that Palestinian historiography on the Palestinian national movement tended to neglect the mid-1980s as a period, which is often described as a very complicated period full of division within the Palestinian national movement. Mm-hmm. The other aspect is that I thought that there was no comprehensive look at the decline of the Palestinian left and in particular the decline of the PFLP. And I saw that there was a correlation between the decline of the PFLP and this particular period of Palestinian history. So that is what started me to look into the marginalization of the Palestinian left, trying to locate its origins in a time which was, again, usually neglected, instead of just starting from usual time frame, for instance, the collapse of the Soviet Union or the Oslo Accords. Concerning the research, I started in the most classical way possible when it comes to history, because I decided to rely on written documentation. And one of the perks of studying the Palestinian national movement is that the diversity that has always characterized the PLO and all of the Palestinian national movement really entailed that each faction produced a huge amount of documents, and each faction had its own mouthpiece. In the PFLP's case, that was the Al-Hadaf magazine, which was founded by Ghassan Kanafani in the late 1960s. Al-Hadaf had all kinds of documents, official communiques, statements from the leaders, interviews, reply to other political figures, both Palestinian and Arabs. So these represented the bulk of my sources, but I also used other kind of documents produced by either other Palestinian factions, the PLO or Arab state, or really any political figure or entity which had a role in the events that I approached. But I also needed to formulate a good methodology to read all of these documents, because one of the risks that I immediately realized was that I risked becoming like an echo chamber for the propaganda or the narrative of the PFLP, and I wanted to mitigate that risk. So what I've done was adopting a double method in my reading. On the one hand, I started to read diachronically these documents, so following how the PFLP related to certain issues, how it behaved, what position it expressed along a certain time frame. So I could spot the differences, the changes, and even contradictions. At the same time, I added to this diachronic reading a synchronic reading of documents produced by other factions, or, as I said, Arab state or political figures in general, and also a synchronic reading of the general literature on the Palestinian national movement, which is, of course, quite wide. And this allowed me to mitigate this risk and also check what was the real position of the PFLP, how other factions responded to its position, and so on and so forth. And this allowed me, I think, to preserve a good degree of objectivity, avoiding to just repeat the PFLP's narrative.
Yeah, for sure. And I have read most of the book by now, and I do think that you do that quite well. And one of the main theses in some ways of the book is that there is a sense that the PFLP in some ways should have been an obvious alternative to both the PNA camp, the Palestinian National Authority camp, and the Islamists. So Hamas is the biggest one, but also Islamist Jihad and the others. So the question, I guess, would be why? Why has the PFLP been marginalized? And can you trace the roots of its marginalization for us?
Okay, so, well, first of all, when it comes to the idea that the PFLP should have been the alternative to these two camps, I mean, we should start by saying that the PFLP itself always described its political proposal as alternative, first of all to Fatah and subsequently to Hamas. I mean, even the adoption of Marxist-Leninism in late 1960s was related to this need to be distinguished from Fatah's wider and more inclusive nationalism, which was not ideologically defined. So themselves presented themselves as an alternative. Then when it comes to the current situation and the impasse that the Palestinian national movement in 2007, I mean, we should look at the fact that we have today two main poles in Palestinian politics, which means we have two authorities more concerned with preserving power over their enclaves, be it the Gaza Strip or chunks of the West Bank, and two poles that have lost a great deal of their legitimacy, if not all. They are unable today to really represent popular opinion and the Palestinian audience, not only in Palestine, but also in the diaspora. And they also represent just really two versions of a conservative platform. One is Islamist and one is secular. So I think that the Palestinian national movement would benefit incredibly from a progressive agenda, from a party capable of really proposing, for instance, an analysis that takes into consideration class much more, that bring again into the national debate important issues such as for instance, the role of Palestinians in the diaspora, which have been neglected since the Oslo Accords, or what kind of state should be built after liberation. Is liberation linked to the idea of a Palestinian state again? And so on and so forth. I mean, there are countless of these issues. So the PFLP had in its history the political capital to embody this kind of progressive option, but it has lost this ability, and it has been unable to really embody any credible progressive agenda, at least since 2007, if not even earlier. So the PFLP has lost its ability to really embody this progressive agenda. And in my study, I trace the beginning of this marginalization in the crisis that the PFLP lived after the expulsion of the PLO from Beirut due to the second Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which entailed the end of the Palestinian sanctuary in the country. And I actually locate the beginning of the marginalization in this specific period of Palestinian history, because it entailed for the PFLP the inability to continue to perform its revolutionary role. The PFLP always claimed to be the revolutionary option in the PLO, the one that was actually stating the correct nationalist line. But after 1982, it was unable for the PFLP to still have this revolutionary performance. When in Jordan, the PFLP and other Palestinian leftist organizations could call and act for instance, for the overthrow of the Hashemite kingdom and the creation of a socialist state in Jordan. When in Lebanon, the collaboration with the Lebanese national movement meant that the PFLP was fighting for the end of confessionalism in the country. But after 1982, they lost this option. The armed struggle was really virtually ended, at least for the PFLP and at least at the beginning. So the PFLP had always increasing problem in really performing this revolutionary option, which consequently led to an increasing loss of credibility in its political proposal.
So this brings us to sort of like the subtitle of the book, loyal opposition. The PFLP was the main rival to Fatah within the PLO structure, and yet they ascribe to what you call loyal opposition. So can you explain what that means exactly?
Yeah, sure. Actually, this question allows me to explain one of the main arguments which I make to explain the decline of the Palestinian left and the PFLP in particular. So loyal opposition is a definition that has been used very often to describe the PFLP, but also other factions on the left, such as the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And basically what it means is that the PFLP ascribed to some shared values around which all of the Palestinian faction actually gathered. For instance, the idea that Palestinian political action should be autonomous from interferences from Arab states, that Palestinians should be at the vanguard for the fight for liberation, unlike in previous phases when, for instance, the Pan-Arab option was the dominant one. The PFLP also believed, like other factions, in the need to respect the legality and the rule that were regulating life within the PLO and its institutions. For instance, the idea that consensus should be reached before any major decision was taken was one of the most important principles to which the PFLP adhered. But also loyal opposition meant that the PFLP actually reaped some benefit from being integrated into the PLO structure. Both political and material. The PLO provided an incredible platform for the PFLP from which to reach out to allies worldwide and make its voice heard in a much wider way. But also the PFLP received funding by participating to the PLO, where Arab financing or financing from other sources were then allocated to each faction according to a quota system. So these are some of the reasons that led the PFLP to be a loyal opposition and always seek to maintain integration in the PLO, even when there was a conflict and that would lead to the PFLP withdrawing from certain institutions such as the Executive Committee and so on and so forth. But these at times could be in contradiction with the idea of being alternative to Fatah, to the real revolutionary option in the Palestinian national movement. The problem emerged after 1982 when the PFLP became unable to strike a balance between opposition and integration. And this is what I called the opposition-integration dilemma. This inability to really find a balance between these two contradictory priorities would lead to a pattern in his political agency, which I define policy fluctuation. Actually, I draw this definition from an article on the PFLP, one of the few written by Assad Abu Khalil in 1987, which used this definition to describe the PFLP orientation towards foreign partners. But actually, this could be applied to all of the PFLP's policies. So the PFLP's political agency started to fluctuate between these two main poles, and this led to a loss in the credibility of its political proposal and in the loss of effectiveness of its ability to actually influence the direction of the Palestinian national movement. And moreover, this opposition integration dilemma also interacted with other controversial aspects of PFLP's policy making, such as, for instance, its relations with foreign allies such as Syria, or later on, the relation between the exiled PFLP leadership and the new emerging leadership in the occupied Palestinian territories that was playing an increasingly important role in the context of the first Intifada. So these sources of tensions produced these policy fluctuation that contributed incredibly to the marginalization of the PFLP within the larger Palestinian national movement.
And so in our pre-chat, I kind of made this seemingly random comparison between the PFLP and the FSA, the Free Syrian Army. And we had a chat about it, and I don't think in itself it's a very good comparison. They're very different times, very different contexts, very different everything. But one thing that I found striking in some ways, I think about it a lot, especially in the past few years, especially since 2016, I've been thinking about this a lot, is sort of like the failures of reaching a broader audience, a failure of including, or kind of, you might call it the failure of PR in some ways, like not actually knowing how to reach an audience that did not already agree with you in some ways. The FSA has been critiqued and criticized by supporters of the Syrian revolution as well, of not doing enough to appeal to minorities in the early years when this would have been, let's say, much more efficient, rather than they tried to do it later on, but it was, by then I think it was already a bit too late. The PFLP, it's different. It's not the same thing. They didn't have an Islamism issue, or they didn't have a religious conservatism issue. They more had an issue of, as you mentioned, the tension of between being in opposition while at the same time insisting or prioritizing, I should say, being integrated within the PLO structure. So let's reflect a bit about this. Like, what are some of your thoughts when I made that comparison? And we can use this to sort of transition to not necessarily dwell too much on PFLP and FSA, because as I said, it's not necessarily a very good comparison, but more the PFLP's relationship to foreign powers, as you mentioned, and especially Syria in this case. And I should say, and the follow-up question will be obviously the role of Israel, because that's kind of the elephant in the room here. But I would be also curious, if you want, I actually forgot to ask you, but like the PFLP's role within the Lebanese context as well. It's actually incredible to me that I forgot to mention Lebanon, because I just work on Lebanon and think about Lebanon all the time, and I didn't even think about it in the same way. So let's talk about the PFLP in its early years, I guess, but in the context of Lebanon, and then by extension the relationship with Syria and so on.
Okay, so you're really bringing up a lot. So
yes.
let's see what we can do here. So if I'm supposed to start with the PFLP role in Lebanon, Lebanon provided an opportunity for the PFLP to continue performing this revolutionary role. It is well known that the PFLP was much more eager in participating directly in the fight led by the Lebanese national movement, this coalition of movement that wanted to end confessionalism in Lebanon, something that actually Arafat and Fatah were quite unwilling to do. At the beginning of the Lebanese civil war, Fatah wanted actually to have a proper relation with all of the factions involved. Lebanon was an opportunity for the PFLP. It allowed the PFLP to reach an incredibly wide audience globally. Just think of the iconic interview that Kanafani gave in the PFLP's bureau in Beirut. But at the same time, the Lebanese experienced the building of a quasi-state there was also to a certain extent a trap for the whole of the Palestinian national movement, really. Because it is in Lebanon that the PFLP and other factions went through a bureaucratization process, which would eventually, let me say, put it in that way, kill the proper militant and revolutionary ethos that was informing the PFLP in its early years. And this bureaucratization, the idea that revolution was becoming a job, actually impeded to a certain extent renewal within the PFLP when this was much needed, particularly in the 1980s and even more so after the outbreak of the first Intifada. So, I mean, yes, of course, the relation of the PFLP with Lebanon and its political arena is very controversial. And again, we can transition through Lebanon to the relation that the PFLP had with a country like Syria, which is one of the most, I think, controversial relation in our politics, not only between the PFLP and Syria, but also between the Syria and the whole of the Palestinian national movement. Actually, I mean, this is a relation that goes to personal, individual level, to factional level and institutional level. Just think about how the personal story of George Habash, which had been arrested in Syria and then in some occasion had to flee from Damascus because of conflict between the PLO and Syria, which would put him at risk, despite the PFLP had moved its headquarters to Damascus after 1982. So, I mean, if we are to consider the relation between Syria and the Palestinian national movement and the Palestinian cause in general, I mean, today we tend to forget how contested and how controversial this relation was. In our chat before this interview, you brought up the 1976 invasion of Syria, of Lebanon by Syria, I'm sorry. But we can also mention, for instance, the backing that Syria gave to the Shia movement, Amal, during the so-called War of the Camps, in which Amal tried to get rid of the Palestinian armed presence from Beirut and the south of Lebanon by besieging the Palestinian refugee camp. And we have countless other occasions in which Syria was in conflict with the Palestinians. But today we have, particularly on the left of the political spectrum, we see a trend in which Syria is simply put in the so-called resistant camp. And this is really telling of one of the problems of the Arab left and sometimes even the global left, even the European left, because many of the official Arab left have been unable to go beyond the Cold War calculation, beyond the division into camps, one in which of course, the USA and Israel are the main imperialist forces, while anybody who's in the other camp is really the resistance. It doesn't matter whether it's really Russian capitalists or local Islamists. They're just resisting. I mean, of course, both Israel and the USA are still pushing hegemonic policies in the region, but so are Russia and Iran, just to make two example. And really, this inability to go beyond this Cold War division is telling of the inability of a faction such as the PFLP, but this is really relatable to all of the Arab left, to at least the official left, to formulate a new analysis of society. And by the way, in this analysis, really class, which should be at the center of any progressive agenda, is really marginalized. So then we started with the idea of comparing the PFLP and the FSA. I mean, this is a little bit of a straight jump into another subject, I guess. And the comparison is actually very challenging. And it's funny because maybe you find the only comparative term where the leftist faction is less fragmented than its counterpart, which doesn't happen very frequently. But this suggestion made me think of the importance of having a proper platform, a proper counter-hegemonic platform to propose. And this is why I think both a faction like the PFLP and the Syrian National Coalition, or the FSA, were unable to gather consensus around their proposal. In the case of the Syrian National Coalition, I think that division within this camp were central in the failure of the FSA to present a proper counter-hegemonic proposal to the Ba'athist state. And I think that the main division, among all of the division that we could spot, was between the internal leadership, the internal activists, which had created certain very interesting experiment like the local coordination committee, which really were proposing a new way of doing politics as opposed to the authoritarian Ba'athist model. But the outside leadership had a different view of what was happening in 2011 and about the Syrian revolution. They were really reading what was happening there as a possible second round of the uprising that occurred at the end of the 1970s and in the early 1980s, one in which, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood was the dominant faction, but not the only one. So they could not, from the outside, they could not really understand the new dynamics of the Syrian uprising and really just saw it as an occasion to revenge from what happened before. And this, I think, played an incredible role, a central role in preventing the Syrian National Coalition from putting forward a credible platform, which could be actually have an appeal also to minorities, as you said. And this is really telling of the fact that you can have good values, you can have good proposition, financial backing, political backing from powers all over the world, but if you are unable to put forward a real counter-hegemonic cultural and political proposal, you are likely to fail in this endeavor.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you you made the comparison actually better than the way I made it. Like, speaking of comparisons, in the book you do use two other examples that are not directly related to the PLO, the Egyptian Communist Movement and the Kurdistan Workers Party, or PKK. Can you expand a bit on that? Why these two? Why did you choose these two? And what are some of the conclusions in some ways from the comparisons?
Yeah, so I decided to add this comparative chapter because first of all, I wanted to test the arguments that I made throughout the book. I wanted to see if concepts such as the opposition-integration dilemma could work in other contexts. And also I wanted my book to be possibly relevant also for people outside Palestinian studies. So anybody really into the history of the global left, anybody interested in the history of leftist national liberation movement, or also in the controversial relation between Marxism and nationalism. So I thought that the Egyptian Communist Movement and the Kurdistan Workers Party, the PKK, really gave me the chance to do so. Because if you, for instance, think of the Egyptian Communist Movement, and I refer in particular to the second wave of the movement, the one that participated to the early 1950s event, the Nasserist coup and the following decades, they really went through some of the same dilemmas that the PFLP lived. They were a leftist, a Marxist movement that always prioritized the national cause, that they saw nationalism as a way to reach the masses, because the issue of national emancipation was very popular in Egyptian politics, of course. But in doing so, they decided to play on the field set by other forces, and in particular, the Free Officer movement, which would come to power and become the dominant power in Egyptian politics, of course. So this camp was culturally and politically dominated by the Nasserist option. This was a thing that exposed the Egyptian Communist movement to some of the same fluctuations that the PFLP also lived, because the Egyptian communists always sought to integrate the dominant national bloc, to a certain extent renounce to put forward once again their own alternative, their own counter-hegemonic platform, and they thought that by integrating the Nasserist regime, they could be able to influence the orientation of this regime. But actually, if we look at the Egyptian history, we see how it was really the contrary. I mean, the Egyptian regime and the Nasserist regime was able to borrow, for instance, tropes from Egyptian Marxists when this suited it best. So, for instance, after the failure of the experiment of the United Arab Republic, the Egyptian regime pursued the way of Arab socialism with much more strength, and borrowed the ideas and also borrowed intellectual from the left. But when the left actually posed a danger, the Nasserist regime never hesitated to repress the communists, and these actually contributed to the decline of the second wave of Egyptian communists. Quite the contrary, the PKK was always able to maintain this radical proposal, this counter-hegemonic proposal, while acting in a very diversified national movement, just like the Palestinian national movement, one in which there were different ideas of Kurdish national liberation, which were often in competition with each other. So the PKK, one of its key features is that it was not born as a properly nationalist faction, unlike the PFLP, whose roots are to be traced back to the Arab nationalist movement. The PKK was born in the context of the urban radical left in Turkey of the 1970s. And this allowed the PKK always to use the national issues as a way to mobilize its membership towards societal transformation, and in later years even towards individual transformation. So when the PKK was experienced important crises such as, again, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of existing socialism, or the apprehension of Abdullah Öcalan, it was able to renew itself and abandon certain of its main ideological tenets, such as Marxist-Leninism, and embrace a different but still radical agenda. So this is the case of anarchist municipalism or democratic confederalism. The PKK was then able to emancipate itself from the idea that national liberation equated to statehood. And this was always the case for the PKK. So today, the PKK is still able to gather consensus around its platform and act in totally different contexts. So democratic confederalism is implemented both in southeastern Turkey by participating to municipal elections, and also in northeastern Syria, in the Rojava. Of course, now the situation has changed. There are some military aspects that should be taken into account, but nonetheless, the PKK in these years gathered local and international consensus among its options and a good deal of support, particularly in Europe, while the PFLP has never been able to do so. The PFLP actually always lacked the ideological elaboration of a faction like the PKK. Still today, the main ideological document, the founding principle of the PFLP, are always the same, are still those that were formulated in the late 1960s. So there is a clear lack of re-elaboration, which is anyway much needed. Doesn't mean that all of that was said in the 1960s has lost its meaning, but still, I mean, it is not credible that nothing has changed and no re-elaboration is needed. So again, the main conclusion is that, again, for a radical force, for a progressive force to remain relevant, it has to reformulate its counter-hegemonic proposal and to hope to continue to survive and be relevant in its own specific context, but even regionally and globally.
The last question is not easy either. The elephant in the room, again, it's obviously Israel, PFLP's main ideological enemy. The role of Israel towards Palestinians, especially in Lebanon, it's well known, I guess. 1982 invasion, the invasion before that, the massacres that followed the 1982 invasion, especially, and so on. But let's assume that not everyone knows the details, just to be fair to the audience and make this episode kind of like internally coherent. Can you speak about the role of Israel in weakening the PFLP, as I mentioned, the invasion, the assassination of Kanafani, notably, of course, and link it to some of the actions, even including controversial actions by the PFLP and or its allies within the territories that, are historical Palestine, essentially?
I mean, first of all, I would like to say that in my research, I wanted to focus on the PFLP on response to global challenges. Of course, Israeli repression was one of those challenges, because all of the Palestinian national movement has always had to deal with Israeli repression. But I wanted to see how the PFLP responded subjectively to these challenges rather than just ascribe the cause of its decline to external factors. When it comes to Israel, so this is made clear if we look at other Palestinian factions and how they acted. For instance, we know that Israel resorted throughout its history to targeted assassination. You mentioned the killing of Hassan Kanafani. But probably Hamas, the Islamist Palestinian faction, had to endure a higher degree of repression, especially in recent years. Assassinations were frequent for Hamas leaders. We could just remember its founding leaders, Sheikh Yassin, or other prominent leaders such as Abdelaziz Arantizi or Yahya Ayyash, and so on and so forth. But Hamas has always been able to replace those leaders and so to renew its internal structure, something that the PFLP was never as good as Hamas at doing this. When it comes to, for instance, targeted assassination, they had a role in contributing to the decline of the PFLP. If we look at the people that were actually killed, you mentioned Kanafani. Kanafani was probably the only real ideologue that the PFLP ever had. I mean, the PFLP was never famous for its ideological elaboration. It really took inspiration from political platform all over the world, be it Maoism or what Che Guevara thoughts on revolutionary violence. The same can be said for Frantz Fanon and so on and so forth. It would be really interesting to know what Kanafani would have thought about some of the major changes and the major issues that the PFLP had to face throughout its history. So this was really a huge blow to the PFLP, in my opinion. Another example is the killing of Abu Ali Mustafa, the second Secretary General of the PFLP, killed during an Israeli raid shortly after its return to Palestine. And he was a figure that could really gather transfactional consensus around himself. It was well respected for its role in setting up the PFLP military apparatus. And when Israel killed him, this led the PFLP exposed to a higher degree of internal fragmentation, because no other personality could match him when it comes to pulling together different orientation and different vision. And as fragmentation worsened, we could really speak of different branches of the PFLP which sometimes do not operate under the same umbrella, especially today with physical division. So in that sense, I think that the Israeli repression contributed to the decline of the PFLP. But again, this always comes back to the idea that the main problem is the inability of a faction like the PFLP to respond to these challenges, renew its both rank and file and leadership. Well, again, the link with some of the action that the PFLP carried out in its history, again, it's a huge jump again. But I mean, while doing my research, I never really found a proper reevaluation of what this operation meant for the PFLP, nor substantial regrets. I mean, and it's a little bit controversial to present this to maybe a public which is not really into the role that armed struggle had for the Palestinian national movement. What I can say is that at a certain point, the PFLP deemed these external operations, the most famous of which were the hijacking of plane in the 1970s, as not useful for the purpose. I mean, these operations helped the PFLP to popularize the Palestinian cause to a certain extent, but since at times it relied to more extreme factions such as the Japanese Red Army, really it could not control the outcome, and these ultimately backfired. I mean, again, this provided at times the excuse to Israel to hit hard in its retaliation. So probably one of the greatest mistakes was not formulating a proper strategy when it came to external operations. So what kind of objective should be hit? What kind of objective were allowed to be on the list of the PFLP? Are Israeli civilians a target? Should they just limit themselves to military targets? So again, there was not really a reevaluation of this story. At least I did not encounter it either in interviews or in the documents that I read. And this is telling of the PFLP inability to look at its past and also reformulate its platform and renew its vision and its views of its struggle. Again, to go forward, to put forward a new political proposal, one has to really make an analysis of what happened and how the PFLP got to the position that is living today. I mean, one where the PFLP is really not having any significant influence over the Palestinian national movement.
Well, thank you for that answer. So on my side, I've kind of had everything that I wanted to say, at least at this stage of the conversation. What can you tell us about the book that you didn't have time to expand upon, and we'll sort of use that as the closing segment of the episode?
Okay, well, I think that, I mean, the main idea behind this book was also to contribute to the renewal of a debate, of an academic and political debate about the Palestinian national movement. And I wanted really to put forward some of the ideas and the issues that have been, I think, neglected in the last years. I really hope that this could make a contribution in that sense, and really that could be like a tip for a deeper conversation on how a new progressive option should be enacted in the context of the Palestinian national movement. I'm not sure whether a revival of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine is possible, but what I'm sure is that the Palestinian national movement, as many other political reality in the world today, need a progressive option, a progressive platform. So the sooner the Palestinians in that case, but I mean, this is really up for everybody, as soon as they start considering how to renew this progressive option within its national movement, their national movement, the better. Because really, there are many issues that are not addressed at all, and that would really benefit from a progressive take on those issues.
On that note, Saverio, thank you a lot for your time, and yeah, all the best and good luck to you.
Thank you, and thanks for having me.